In the heart of the ancient land, where the red earth meets the endless sky, stood the village of Iruwa. The morning sun painted the mud houses golden, and smoke from cooking fires danced lazily into the air. Children's laughter mixed with the sound of talking drums that echoed across the farmlands. The sweet smell of roasted maize filled the air as women prepared breakfast. Goats bleated softly as they searched for grass, while chickens pecked at the red dust around the compound. Palm trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves whispering ancient secrets. At the center of the village stood a magnificent sight that made everyone stop and stare. Okoro's new yam barn rose high above all others, its thatched roof gleaming like a crown. The walls were strong and straight, built with the finest mud bricks. Inside, rows upon rows of yams lay carefully arranged, more than anyone had ever seen. Villagers gathered around the barn, their voices filled with wonder and praise. "Okoro has been truly blessed by the ancestors," they whispered. The elderly nodded with approval, while young men looked on with admiration and respect. Okoro wiped the sweat from his brow as he arranged the last row of yams in his barn. His hands were rough from years of hard work, but his heart was full of joy. He had worked from dawn to dusk for many seasons to build this barn and grow these fine yams. "The earth rewards those who serve her faithfully," he said to himself, remembering his father's words. Every morning, he had risen before the rooster's call to tend his farm. He had cleared the bush, planted the seeds, and watered his crops even during the dry season. His neighbors often saw him working alone in his fields when others rested. He never complained or asked for help, believing that honest work would bring its own reward. The ancestors had smiled upon his efforts, and now his barn overflowed with the finest yams in all of Iruwa. Young boys gathered around him, eager to learn his secrets. "Uncle Okoro, how did you grow such big yams?" they asked with bright eyes. He smiled kindly and shared his knowledge freely, never keeping secrets that could help others succeed. Across the narrow path from Okoro's compound lived Auntie Mornike, a woman known throughout Iruwa for her wisdom and kindness. She had lived in the village longer than most could remember, and people often came to her for advice about marriage, children, and farming. Her compound was neat and well kept, with beautiful flowers growing around her small house. She kept the finest chickens in the village and was known for her delicious palm wine that she served to visitors. During village meetings, the elders listened carefully to her words. But as Auntie Mornike stood in her doorway, watching the crowds admire Okoro's barn, something dark stirred in her heart. Her smile remained bright on her face, but her eyes grew cold as winter rain. She remembered when her own barn had been the largest in the village, when people had praised her farming skills. "Good morning, Auntie Mornike," called out a neighbor. "Isn't Okoro's barn wonderful? The ancestors have truly blessed him." She nodded and smiled sweetly, but inside, her heart burned with a jealousy as fierce as the harmattan wind. That evening, as the village settled into peaceful sleep, Auntie Mornike sat alone in her compound. The moon cast long shadows across the ground, and night birds called from the forest. She stared at Okoro's barn, its shape dark against the starry sky. "Why should he have more than I do?" she whispered to the darkness. "I have lived here longer. I have helped more people. I deserve to be the one they praise." Her fingers traced patterns in the dust as bitter thoughts filled her mind. She remembered the old days when her late husband's barn had been the pride of Iruwa. People had traveled from neighboring villages to see their yam harvest. But those days were gone now, buried with her husband in the village cemetery. Now Okoro had taken her place in the people's hearts. As the night grew deeper, Auntie Mornike's envy grew stronger. She forgot all the times Okoro had helped her carry water from the well. She forgot how he had shared his harvest with widows and orphans. All she could see was his success, and all she could feel was the burning pain of jealousy eating at her soul. Elder Bamadil sat under the ancient baobab tree that had watched over Iruwa for countless generations. His white beard flowed down to his chest, and his eyes held the wisdom of many seasons. Children gathered around him each evening to hear stories of the old days. "Listen well, my children," he said in his deep, gentle voice. "Our ancestors teach us that a village is like a body. When one part is sick, the whole body suffers. When one part is healthy, the whole body rejoices. The children nodded, though they did not fully understand his words. He had noticed the shadow that had fallen across Auntie Mornike's face when people praised Okoro. As a keeper of village wisdom, he could sense when harmony was threatened. Envy is like a termite, he had often said. It eats away at the wood until the whole house falls down. That night, Elder Bamadiel looked up at the stars and spoke to the ancestors. Guide us through the troubles that are coming, he prayed. Give us the wisdom to see clearly and the strength to do what is right. The wind carried his words into the forest, where ancient spirits listened and prepared for what was to come. Ao was 10 years old, with bright eyes that missed nothing and ears that heard everything. While other children played games in the dust, he liked to watch the adults and listen to their conversations. His grandmother always said he was too curious for his own good. He had seen Auntie Mornike standing in her doorway, watching Okoro's barn with an expression he couldn't understand. He had noticed how her smile disappeared when she thought no one was looking. Something was not right, but he didn't know what it could be. The next morning, Ao saw Auntie Mornike walking toward the forest with a small basket in her hands. This was strange because everyone knew the deep forest was dangerous, especially for someone walking alone. His curiosity burned like a fire in his chest. He followed her at a distance, staying hidden behind trees and bushes. The forest grew darker as they went deeper, and strange sounds echoed from the shadows. Ao's heart beat fast, but he continued to follow, knowing that something important was happening that the adults needed to know about. Deep in the forest, where the trees grew so thick that sunlight barely touched the ground, stood an old shrine that most villagers had forgotten. It was a place where dark spirits dwelt, spirits that could grant wishes but always demanded a terrible price. Auntie Mornike knelt before the crumbling stones, her basket filled with offerings, cola nuts, palm wine, and a white chicken that struggled in her hands. Her voice shook as she spoke the forbidden words her grandmother had whispered to her many years ago. Spirits of the deep forest, she called out, I come seeking justice. Okoro has what should be mine. Let his success become his suffering. Let his joy turn to sorrow. The chicken squawked as she placed it on the altar, and the forest seemed to grow even darker. From his hiding place behind a massive tree, Ao watched in terror. He had heard stories of people who sought help from forest spirits, and none of those stories ended well. He knew he should run back to the village and tell the elders, but fear had frozen his feet to the ground. The air grew cold despite the afternoon heat, and strange whispers seemed to come from every direction. Auntie Mornike finished her ritual and hurried away, leaving Ao alone with the dark spirits and his terrible secret. 3 days after Auntie Mornike's visit to the forest shrine, strange things began to happen in Iruwa. The first sign came when Okoro opened his magnificent barn and found that half of his carefully stored yams had turned black and rotten overnight. This cannot be, he said, staring at the ruined harvest. These yams were perfect yesterday. How can they spoil so quickly? He called his neighbors to witness the strange sight, and they stood in shocked silence, unable to explain what had happened. But the trouble did not stop with Okoro's yams. Mrs. Aduni's chickens began laying eggs with blood inside. Chief Okafor's goats fell sick and refused to eat grass. The village well, which had always provided sweet, clear water, suddenly tasted bitter as medicine. Elder Bamadiel stroked his white beard thoughtfully as he examined the spoiled yams. This is not natural, he declared. Something evil has entered our village. We must find the source before it spreads further. His words sent shivers of fear through the gathering crowd. By sunset, the news had spread to every compound in Iruwa. Mothers held their children closer, and men gathered in worried groups to discuss what should be done. As the days passed, the mysterious sickness spread through Iruwa. Crops that had been green and healthy began to wither and die. Animals that had been strong and fat grew thin and weak. Even the palm trees began to lose their leaves. The village market, which had once been filled with laughter and bargaining voices, became quiet and fearful. Traders from other villages stopped coming, afraid that the curse might follow them home. Women whispered prayers as they cooked, and men looked over their shoulders as they worked their farms. "What have we done to anger the spirits?" people asked each other. They performed cleansing rituals and made offerings at the village shrine, but nothing seemed to help. The darkness continued to spread, touching every family in some way. Okoro felt especially troubled because the curse had started with his yams. Some people began to whisper that perhaps he had done something to bring this evil upon the village. He could see suspicion growing in their eyes, and it hurt him more than the loss of his harvest. At night, children cried in their sleep, and adults lay awake listening to strange sounds from the forest. The talking drums, which had once carried messages of joy, now beat out warnings and calls for help. As the curse continued to spread, fear began to eat away at the trust that had held Iruwa together for generations. Neighbors who had once shared meals and worked together began to eye each other with suspicion. Old grudges were remembered, and new accusations were whispered in the darkness. "Someone among us has brought this evil," declared Chief Okafor during a village meeting. "Someone has made a pact with dark spirits, and now we all suffer for their greed." The crowd murmured agreement, their faces twisted with worry and anger. Fingers began to point in different directions. Some suspected the young widow who lived at the edge of the village. Others whispered about the strange old man who collected herbs in the forest. A few even dared to suggest that Okoro himself might have used dark magic to make his yams grow so large. Auntie Mornike sat among the accusers, nodding sadly at each suggestion. "This is a terrible thing," she said, her voice full of false sympathy. "Poor Okoro especially. To have his success turned into such suffering." But inside, her heart rejoiced as she watched suspicion tear the village apart. Elder Bamadiel watched the growing hatred with deep sadness. "Listen to yourselves," he said quietly. "Fear is making you forget who you are. A village divided against itself cannot stand." Ao carried his terrible secret like a heavy stone in his chest. Every day he watched Auntie Mornike move through the village, accepting sympathy and offering comfort to others, while he alone knew the truth about what she had done in the forest. He wanted to tell his parents, but who would believe that respected Auntie Mornike could do such evil? He was just a child, and she was an elder whom everyone trusted. They would think he was making up stories or had misunderstood what he saw. At night, Ao dreamed of the dark forest and the forbidden shrine. He heard the cold whispers again and saw the fear in Auntie Mornike's eyes as she made her wicked bargain. He woke up sweating and afraid, knowing that he held the key to saving his village but not knowing how to use it. During the day, he followed Auntie Mornike from a distance, hoping to find more proof of her guilt. He saw her watching the suffering of others with secret satisfaction. He noticed how she asked many questions about who was affected by the curse, as if she was checking to see if her magic was working properly. The weight of his knowledge grew heavier each day, and Ao began to understand why adults sometimes looked so tired and worried. 2 weeks had passed since the curse began, and Iruwa was no longer the happy village it had once been. The crops continued to fail, the animals grew weaker, and even the children had stopped playing their games. A gray cloud of despair seemed to hang over every compound. The village elders called meeting after meeting, trying to find a solution. They consulted the village priest, who performed cleansing ceremonies and cast divination bones. They sent messages to wise men in neighboring villages, asking for their advice. Nothing worked. "We must find the source of this evil," Elder Bamadiel insisted. "Until we root it out, our village will continue to suffer." But despite all their searching and questioning, the truth remained hidden like a snake in tall grass. Some families began to talk about leaving Iruwa to start new lives in other villages. The thought of their ancient community breaking apart filled the elders with even deeper sorrow than the curse itself. Okoro spent his days trying to save what remained of his crops, but it was like trying to hold water in a basket. Everything he touched seemed to wither and die. He began to wonder if he really was cursed, and if his presence was bringing harm to his beloved village. Elder Bamadiel sat alone under the baobab tree, seeking guidance from the ancestors. The great tree had weathered many storms and seen many generations pass beneath its branches. Its ancient wisdom seemed to whisper to him in the rustling of its leaves. When the obvious path leads nowhere, he murmured to himself, wise men look for hidden trails. He had lived long enough to know that the most dangerous enemies often wore friendly faces. Someone in the village was not what they seemed to be. He thought about each villager, searching his memory for clues. Who had been acting strangely? Who had been asking too many questions? Who seemed less surprised than others by each new disaster? Slowly, a pattern began to form in his wise old mind. The next morning, Elder Bamadiel began his own quiet investigation. He visited each compound, listening carefully to what people said and watching what they did. He paid special attention to who seemed genuinely worried and who seemed to be merely pretending. As he walked through the village, he noticed young Ao following him at a distance. The boy's face was troubled, and his eyes held secrets too heavy for such young shoulders. Elder Bamadiel made a mental note to speak with the child privately when the time was right. On the 17th day of the curse, tragedy struck the heart of Iruwa. Little Kemi, the daughter of the village blacksmith, fell into a deep sleep that no medicine could break. Her parents wept beside her still form, begging the spirits to spare their innocent child. The sight of the sleeping girl broke the last bit of control the villagers had been holding on to. Their fear turned to rage, and their suspicion became accusation. They gathered in the village square like an angry storm, demanding that someone be punished for bringing this evil upon them. "We know someone here has made a pact with dark spirits," shouted Chief Okafor. "Until that person confesses, we will all continue to suffer." The crowd roared their agreement, their faces twisted with anger and desperation. Some villagers grabbed torches and threatened to search every compound until they found evidence of witchcraft. Others called for anyone who seemed suspicious to be banished from the village immediately. The peaceful community that had existed for generations was falling apart like a house built on sand. Elder Bamadiel stood up slowly, his voice cutting through the noise like a sharp knife. "Stop," he commanded. "This madness will not save little Kemi or end our curse. Violence and hatred will only make things worse." Ao watched from the edge of the crowd as his village tore itself apart with anger and fear. He saw his neighbors turning against each other, ready to hurt innocent people because they didn't know who the real enemy was. He thought of little Kemi lying so still and quiet, and he knew he couldn't keep his secret any longer. His hands shook as he pushed through the crowd toward Elder Bamadiel. Adults towered over him like giants, their faces frightening in the torchlight. His voice came out as barely a whisper at first, drowned out by the shouting around him. "Elder Bamadiel," he called, trying to make his voice stronger. "I know something. I saw something." The old man's sharp eyes found him immediately, and he raised his hand to quiet the crowd. "Let the boy speak," Elder Bamadiel commanded. The villagers turned to look at Ao, and he felt his knees go weak under their stare. But he thought again of little Kemi and found his courage. "I followed Auntie Mornike to the forest shrine," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I saw her make offerings to the dark spirits. I heard her curse Okoro's success." His words fell on the crowd like stones thrown into still water, sending ripples of shock through the gathering. A terrible silence fell over the village square as Ao's words sank into everyone's minds. All eyes turned to Auntie Mornike, who stood frozen like a deer caught by hunting lights. Her face went pale, and her mouth opened and closed without making any sound. This cannot be true," she stammered, trying to force her usual kind smile onto her face. "I would never. How can you believe the wild stories of a child?" But her voice shook, and her eyes darted around like a trapped animal looking for escape. Elder Bamadiel stepped forward, his ancient eyes boring into her soul. "The boy speaks the truth," he said quietly. "I have watched you these past days, Mornike. I have seen the false sympathy in your eyes and heard the lies in your voice. You have let envy turn your heart to poison." The crowd began to murmur angrily as they remembered Auntie Mornike's questions about the curse, her eager interest in who was suffering most. Slowly, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, and they saw her guilt written clearly on her terrified face. "Confess," demanded Chief Okafor. "Tell us what you have done." But Auntie Mornike only shook her head, still trying to deny what everyone could now see was the truth. Under the steady gaze of Elder Bamadiel and the angry stares of her neighbors, Auntie Mornike's strength finally crumbled like a wall hit by flood water. Her shoulders began to shake, and tears ran down her cheeks as the terrible weight of her guilt crushed down upon her. I didn't mean for everyone to suffer, she sobbed, falling to her knees in the dust. I only wanted to humble Okoro. I was jealous of his success, jealous of the way everyone praised him while forgetting all I had done for this village. About the offering she had made, about the curse she had called down on Okoro's prosperity. But the spirits tricked me, she cried. They said they would only touch what belonged to Okoro, but instead they spread their darkness over the whole village. I tried to stop it, but I don't know how. Her confession echoed in the quiet square like the wail of a lost soul. Okoro stared at his neighbor with a mixture of hurt and pity. This woman had shared meals at his table and borrowed tools from his compound. Now he understood why his kindness to her had always seemed to make her more bitter instead of grateful. Elder Bamadiel knew that confession alone would not be enough to break the curse that had settled over Iruwa like a dark blanket. The village would need powerful medicine to cleanse away the evil that Auntie Mornike had invited into their midst. We must act quickly, he announced to the gathering. The spirits she called upon will not leave willingly. We need all the wisdom of our ancestors to drive them back to the deep forest where they belong. He sent young men to gather special herbs and ordered the women to prepare purification water. As the sun set behind the palm trees, the entire village gathered in the square for the cleansing ceremony. Elder Bamadiel wore his most sacred robes and carried the staff that had been passed down from generation to generation of village elders. Auntie Mornike was made to stand in the center of the circle, her head bowed in shame. Around her, the villagers held candles and chanted the old prayers their grandparents had taught them. The talking drums beat out ancient rhythms that seemed to make the earth itself tremble. Spirits of darkness, you are not welcome here, Elder Bamadiel called out in a voice that carried power from the ancestors. Return to the shadows where you belong. Leave our village in peace. The ceremony continued through the night, driving away the evil with light, sound, and the combined will of the community. As the first light of dawn broke over Iruwa, something in the air began to change. The oppressive feeling that had hung over the village like thick smoke started to lift. Birds that had been silent for weeks began to sing again, and a gentle breeze carried the smell of fresh earth and growing things. Little Kemi stirred in her sleep and opened her eyes for the first time in 3 days. Her parents wept with joy as she asked for water and complained that she was hungry. Throughout the village, other signs of healing appeared. The bitter well began to taste sweet again, and withered plants showed tiny shoots of new green growth. But the healing was not just physical. As the curse lifted, the suspicion and fear that had divided the villagers began to fade as well. Neighbors who had been ready to fight each other the night before now embraced with tears of relief and forgiveness. Okoro was among the first to approach Auntie Mornike as she sat weeping beside the village shrine. I forgive you, he said simply, offering her his hand. Envy is a sickness that can strike any heart. The important thing is that you have been cured of it now. Elder Bamadiel watched the village come together again with deep satisfaction. This is how a true community heals, he said to young Ao, who had been honored as a hero for his brave revelation. Not just by driving away evil, but by choosing forgiveness over revenge. In the days that followed the cleansing ceremony, Iruwa slowly returned to its former prosperity. Crops began to grow again, animals regained their health, and children's laughter once more filled the air. But Auntie Mornike found that her own healing would take much longer than the village's. Although her neighbors had forgiven her, she could not forgive herself. Every time she looked at little Kemi playing in the dust, she remembered how close she had come to causing the child's death. Every time she passed Okoro's rebuilt barn, she felt shame burn in her chest like a fire. The elders decided that she should serve the village for 1 full year without payment, helping to repair the damage her curse had caused. She would tend the sick animals, help replant the ruined crops, and clean the village shrine every day as penance for her sins. But the hardest punishment was the knowledge of what her envy had cost her. She had been respected and loved by everyone in Iruwa, and now that respect would have to be earned back through years of good deeds and humble service. Envy is indeed a disease, Elder Bamadiel told the gathered villagers during the next village meeting. It eats away at the one who carries it until nothing is left but bitterness and regret. Let Auntie Mornike's story be a warning to us all about the price of jealousy. The villagers nodded solemnly, understanding that they had all learned an important lesson about the danger of letting dark emotions take root in their hearts. As the seasons passed and Iruwa prospered once again, Elder Bamadiel would often gather the children under the baobab tree to tell them the story of Auntie Mornike and the curse that nearly destroyed their village. "Remember this always," he would say, his eyes twinkling in the firelight. "A jealous heart is like a termite-eaten house. It may look strong from the outside, but it will fall when the storms of life come. Better to rejoice in your neighbor's success than to let envy eat away at your soul." The children would nod seriously, though some were too young to fully understand. But as they grew older and faced their own temptations of jealousy and bitterness, they would remember the elders' words and choose the path of contentment and joy. And in the village of Iruwa, where the red earth meets the endless sky, the people learned to celebrate each other's successes as their own, knowing that a community united in happiness is stronger than any curse that darkness can create. As the old proverb says, when your neighbor's barn is full, your own harvest is blessed. But when envy fills your heart, even abundance turns to dust. The talking drums carried this wisdom to neighboring villages, and the story of Iruwa became a lesson that parents would tell their children for generations to come, ensuring that the price of envy would never be forgotten.